Welcome to Commsverse. This session is called Strategic Governance for Microsoft Teams, and today will be presented to you by Michael Pisarek. Over to you, Michael.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, and good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Super happy to be here and to perform this session for you called Strategic Governance in Microsoft Teams. Just before we begin, sponsors, I know that this is not a physical conference and things with COVID are very strange at the moment, but make sure you do visit the sponsors that we have here. There's a very interesting and actually pretty cool VR scenario they've got set up. So once again, being from a company that sponsors some of these events, it is a bit challenging these days to do some of these virtual events. So please go and visit some of our sponsors. So before we begin, a little bit about myself. First of all, thank you for joining me. My name is Michael Pisarek. I am a 6 times Microsoft SharePoint MVP. I used to be the owner and founder of a intranet in a box company, which we were acquired a couple of years ago. Since then, took a little bit of time off, did everything that I wanted to do in terms of, we bought a dog. We just had a baby, an 8-month-old. So if you can hear a baby kind of crying in the background during this session, I do apologize. But really my passion for the last probably year has been around looking at Teams in particular. We're getting ready to launch a new product called Orchestry, which is a tool based a little around Teams governance, but more so around adoption for Office 365 called Orchestry. In addition to that, if you have any questions before or after this, please feel free to get in touch with me. More than happy to help answer any of the questions around this session or just any sort of Teams, SharePoint, Office 365 governance related questions also. So for today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about goals. I really want to level set, what you expect from this session and hopefully what you're going to get out of it. Then we're going to get right into what governance is for Teams. I want to help define the word governance for you. I find that a lot of organizations that we work with, and this was the same when I used to consult a lot in SharePoint for over 10 years, this G word, this governance word is quite misunderstood. So we're going to level set around what governance for Teams is. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what governance for Office 365 is. So one of the great things around, I think, Teams in particular from a governance perspective is all of those capabilities that Microsoft provides you out of the box to implement your governance policies automatically within Teams. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to get into some pragmatic governance examples. So what I really want this session to be for you is a pragmatic session that at the end of it, you're going to get some tools and some understanding, and you can go and implement that within your organization. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about some key takeaways and then how to stay in touch. So session goals, what we want to do. Firstly, I want to kind of help you understand broadly what governance is and what it entails. It's something that we're finding talking to organizations. Governance can be really a really huge thing or a really small thing. First of all, I want to make sure that you understand kind of a definition of governance, which I think is pragmatic and works for most organizations. I want to show you what some of the out-of-the-box options are in Microsoft 365 or Office 365 for implementing your governance settings and policies within there. We're also going to show you some scenarios. So I think the best way to really illustrate governance is through some particular scenarios. So we're going to talk about 3 different organizations on what I call the governance spectrum. And we're going to talk about how they actually came up with their governance policies and how they're implemented within Teams and Office 365. And of course, a whole range of tangible examples then also. So let's get started. So what exactly is governance in Teams? Let's talk about it from a strategic perspective. Really, when you talk about governance for anything, particularly around Teams and Microsoft 365, governance is really that process of defining the people, the processes, the rules and structure that you want to deploy into your Teams environment. A typical governance plan involves things like roles, so different roles for different particular types of users. They could be IT, they could be end users, they could be more team-related pieces like team owners and members. Responsibilities, what each role can essentially do. A lot around processes, so how do people, for instance, in terms of Teams, manage the creation process, manage the archival process and the deletion process of Teams, access and ownerships, and also policies as well. The way that a good governance plan comes from is really those corporate rules and policies that you have within your organization. And the best way that I like to think about governance is really a really great quote from Microsoft right at the top here. Your governance plan should help drive user adoption, right? So we really think, and I really think of governance in terms of helping end users being able to perform particular functions within teams, and using governance as helping guide them through that journey. I think most people think of governance as a way to kind of stop users doing something. I want you to consider thinking about governance in a different way. So instead of thinking of governance as roadblocks, think of it as creating a road that your users can go down to their destination. And because teams are so self-service, because the whole idea with teams is this very dynamic, free-flow environment, you want to have some sort of governance structure that helps users kind of weave their way through that journey also. And we'll talk about that through here as well. In terms of what governance can achieve, there's all the typical stuff that we see. You know, the typical pieces are really from a compliance perspective. So you want to make sure that your governance plan can ensure compliance. But really, in my mind, you want to also make sure that your governance plan can help drive adoption. So one of the things that you can use in terms of some of the governance features and the settings and the policies within the Teams Admin Center or within Office 365 in general is to help light up or remove capabilities from the end user perspective. So that can be really useful. Sprawl is a really big, I think, problem for a lot of organizations using Microsoft Teams. That's probably the biggest challenge for governance and one of the first things that organizations start with. How and what governance policies can we put in place so we can manage that sprawl, manage the creation of teams, maybe make sure there's some naming policies there, but essentially ensuring that whatever content we create within Teams or within Office 365 is managed, so we don't get a whole bunch of teams which are created, which are only used for 5 minutes, or we get stale content. All of the same challenges I think that we previously had with other tools really apply to Teams more. So managing sprawl is a huge thing that governance can help with. Stopping information leaks as well. You know, some typical questions that we see. Are you going to allow guest users into your teams or not? What types of rules or policies are you going to put around sharing content also? And the other part of governance that we're finding that's really working well for a lot of organizations is kind of this simplifying this end user experience. So once again, this idea that when you launch Teams, if you don't change any settings, pretty much most things are available for end users, and it can be a little bit overbearing from that end user perspective. One of the things you can use governance for is to remove some of those capabilities, simplify the user experience, and then maybe as users get additional training or get more comfortable with the tool, part of your governance policy can be then they get those additional capabilities lit up also. So there's a number of things, like I said, that you want to look at governance for. And in terms of governance, there's really no right answer. So what I say here is this is what I call the governance spectrum around Microsoft Teams. There's no real right answer for that. You know, I think there's a right answer for every organization, but there's not a right answer well, there's a right answer for your organization, but there's not a right answer for every single organization. Every single organization is going to be different. So on the left-hand side here, some organizations go down this very tightly controlled sort of process where everything is locked down. Most of the features of Teams are locked down. Users can't really request or can't self-service request Teams. They have to go through an IT process. We're seeing this quite a lot in organization. Once again, if this works for you, this is entirely appropriate also. And what you also find is some organizations, if they're new to Teams and they're a bit hesitant, they might start off on this kind of left-hand side, tightly controlled sort of realm, and then move over a little bit all the way to the right. On the right-hand side is what I call limited control. So this is where if you were to deploy Microsoft Teams out of the box, not change any settings, realistically what's happening is everything is available for your users to use. It means collaboration can be super fast, it can be super agile, but then again, there might be a bit of risk there, right? So you might want to actually turn off some of those capabilities, control the creation of teams or the deletion or the expiration, maybe add some naming policies, all of these little things as well. So what you'll find as you go down this governance journey is you'll probably move across these pieces. Some organizations move entirely where they go from a very tightly controlled process all the way to the right-hand side here to more of a free-form process. But what you'll find is, like I said, you'll find that you'll probably move as an organization, or you even find individual users move between here as you empower them with your governance policies. And the other thing is, why bother? So I think we've talked upon this a little bit, but realistically, if you deploy Microsoft Teams and don't change any settings, pretty much every single capability of Teams is available there. And I'm not sure if you've heard this, but we've definitely heard this from a lot of end users, that there's just so much to Teams, right? There's so many capabilities there. There's so many features. They can get a little bit confused. So the best way to think about it, I think, of why you should spend time developing your governance policies, all the policies stuff and all the, the security stuff is super important. But really the best way to think about it is, imagine if you gave your users an iPhone and you installed every single possible app from the App Store there as well and gave it to a user. That's essentially what you're doing if you're not using some of these governance capabilities that come out of the box with Teams and with Office 365. And the nice thing around this is that a lot of these capabilities of implementing your governance policies in Teams, it's all simple configuration. You don't need any custom code. You don't have to go in a lot of cases, they didn't even do PowerShell. The Teams Admin Center is there for you available as well. And conversely, the other reason is, well, why do we see most organizations don't bother? It's a complex topic, right? Teams has a lot of tentacles and a lot of different tools. Office 365, as you know, is a really large, complex platform. So we find that most organizations simply switch Teams on and wait for something to happen instead of being a little bit more proactive. But hopefully I'm going to show you through the session that, like I said, you can make this, you can kind of change a lot of these settings really easily. And the nice thing is once you change a setting, if you want to go back, you can change that at the same time. So once again, it's a pretty easy process to follow. The other thing that we find as well is, traditionally, I think governance policies used to be these huge rule books. Now you can actually automate a lot of that. And there's a lot of features within Office 365 that allow you to do that. But also we have some third-party tools if you want to get a little bit more complex, I guess. And there's a lot of open source solutions as well in terms of doing additional layers of governance and management around Teams and Office 365. Finally, just to leave you with this, some great tools. Microsoft really has done a really good job in terms of both the adoption side, and they're starting to weave a lot of governance content in there. If you're interested in looking at some of this, probably the best thing to start with is if you go to the Teams adoption area in step 2 in experiment. What we have is what's called a governance quick start, and they have some really great tips. It's like the top 5 or 10 questions. Awesome. It's free. Go find it. The URL is there also. So now that we understand a little bit about what governance is, how does it actually function within Teams and Office 365, right? How do we implement this? How do we automate some of this to make sure that when our users go and they use Teams, that all of our corporate policies, that they're ready to rock and roll? So a couple of things that you need to know. The first thing is that really to understand kind of governance around Teams, you really need to understand governance around Office 365 groups. If you're new to Office 365, you're an admin, for example, I really encourage you to go and learn a little bit about groups, because groups really underpin pretty much everything within Office 365 now, but they really underpin Teams also. And particularly the way that they underpin it, the most practical example is that there's a lot of policies you can put in place around the creation, the retention, and the deletion of teams also. But you're not really doing that at the team level, you're doing that at the group level of which a team is a part of. So we're not going to get too much into this here, but once again, what I would encourage you to do is first really understand what groups are, how they function, and the capabilities that are available there to help you understand how you can implement governance through them. But if we talk about governance and governance settings, what does this look like? This is something that when I speak to a lot of organizations, they just don't understand how many simple kind of knobs and tweaks and settings you can go in to really personalize not only that experience of Teams for your end users, but making sure that they align to your governance policies. So the first part of it is, where are the settings configured? There's different types of settings and rules and policies you can apply to 3 different levels. The first is the team level. These are more of the team-specific things. This is typically done through the Teams Admin Center. The second is at the group level. Now, at the group level, what you're looking at is more of the life cycle around teams. So things like creation, expiration, and deletion, for example. This is all done at the group level. And there's also a whole range of settings around security and compliance. So things like sensitivity labels, or data loss protection, all of those are kind of configured in the security and compliance area, but they apply to groups and teams. You can see where this gets a little bit complex. But if you just look at it from the Teams Admin Center, the easiest way to think about it is you have a range of items within the Teams Admin Center. So for meetings, for instance, we have a few different things. And then each kind of component has got two parts to it. They have the settings part, which is the default that's used by everyone within the organization. So a really common thing for meeting settings is I don't think a lot of people know that you can customize the email invite that gets sent when you have a Teams meeting. So you can actually put in your own logo, your own legal URL, and your own help URL. Awesome, and assign that to people. So you have those settings. And then the other thing is you have policies, and what policies allow you to do is to create specific rule sets. So from your governance plan, you create a specific policy relating to that, and you can assign users to that policy, and then you can move users through those policies also. So there's a range of capabilities there. So think about it in that way. In any setting within Teams, in the Teams Admin Center, you've got your settings, which is kind of overall, and then you've got your policies, which can overwrite those settings, and you can add individual users to. And there's a lot in there, right? There is a ton in there. I'm not sure if anyone's been in the Teams Admin Center. There's a ton of capabilities through there, but also when you go to other areas, there's even more there. So everything from application setup policies, what apps you want to show people, a whole bunch of meeting settings, which we're going to talk about, channel settings, team settings. There's a whole range of goodness here that you can really help you control what's happening within your teams. So instead of going through the Teams Admin Center, which is not that much fun, let's talk about how we would do this. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to cover some pragmatic scenarios here. So we are going to pretend we have three different organizations that we're going to have within the scenarios. And the reason that we have that is these three different organizations match up to our kind of governance spectrum. Side, we've got Lockdown Corp, suitably mentioned because they want to lock everything down. So they lean very heavily to the restrictive settings within teams. Their governance policies are very restrictive. They want to keep super tight control on everything. In the middle, we have Balanced Industries. Balanced Industries want to maintain some balance. So they don't want to use just the out-of-the-box capabilities, which are very open. But when they do make decisions, they try to make sure that they balance both the IT consideration and also the end user side and make those decisions accordingly. And then the last one that we have is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., they're young, they're funky, they're working on whatever new technology is at the moment. So it's probably some blockchain, AI, Uber robot thing. But what they want to do, they really want to empower their organization as much as possible. So typically what Startup Inc. does is they use those out-of-the-box features because they're the most open. But we're going to see here as we go through these particular scenarios, how would Lockdown Corp implement these governance policies? What would Balanced Industries do? And what would Startup Inc. do as well? And hopefully you might see yourself in one of these three, or maybe you're in the middle, but hopefully it's going to get you some ideas. So the first thing that we find that organizations speak about is around teams creation. So the first thing that we have here, whoops, there we go. The first thing is around teams creation. So your decision point here is pretty simple. This is really the first thing. Who is going to be able to create groups and teams within your organization? You're not going to be able to create a team if you can't create a group. The inverse isn't true. You can create a group without a team, but let's not get into that. But really, this is one of the first questions that we find when we're working with organization from a governance standpoint. Who is going to be able to do that? Now, limiting teams creation can aid in controlling sprawl, enforcing some structure there. But of course, if you're limiting people from creating teams, that's going to impact, the agility of your organization. There's also some things there that Microsoft doesn't want you to do to kind of limit that capability also. But the nice thing is you're going to be able to have much more control in terms of how teams are named, how teams are created, who can request them, all of those sorts of things. But obviously that's going to place a pretty large additional burden on your IT team. If you are going to enable kind of self-service creation, which is the default, I think you really need to have some additional governance policies in place. But also you can limit this as well. And this is something that we see more organizations do, that you might have a subset of users which are allowed to go through the Teams interface and create teams. Maybe those users are users that have gone through some sort of training, which is part of your governance policy. So you might say that you've got a role of a site requester. That site requester has to understand Teams. Maybe they have to go through some training. And what they can do then is they can go and they can request Teams through there. And then everyone else, they can't. So you can have a little balance there also. Once again, there's a whole range of tools which are out there currently, whether it's commercial-based tools like ours, or in addition, kind of open source tools, which basically allow you to control this process a little bit more. So instead of just going in and clicking on create team, someone has to go in, they have to fill in, some forms and metadata. Maybe they choose a template, and there's some additional pieces there, but you can do that. So how would this kind of apply to these three scenarios? So Lockdown Corp, of course, they want to lock everything down. So they're disabling the creation of teams through the native UI, and they use a tool to control the request and approval of teams for complete control. Now, stopping end users creating teams, there's tons of articles out there. If you search for anything like that, you'll see that's available. We are seeing a lot of organizations do that. Once again, that's possible. Balanced industries is another approach that we're seeing. So what they've done is they've got some users which are allowed to create teams and typically be site owners. So they have actually got a permission that enables them to go and request groups and teams, and everyone else can't. So what happens is typically if someone else wants a team, for example, they'll go to one of these Teams requesters or Teams power users, and they'll go and request those through the user interface. And the last approach is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. is happy. They just let anyone create a team at any time also. And what you'll find is that that interface for the end user side is going to be a little bit different depending on the permissions that you have. So if you can't create a team, for instance, you're not going to see that ability through there. If you can, you are through Teams. So you've got a couple of options there. The next question is around apps. So as you know, Teams comes with a range of apps. So if you're looking at Teams at the moment, which I'm sure you are, on the left-hand side, you're going to have a bunch of default apps that ship with Teams. So the activity stuff, chat, calls, Teams, calendars, all of that good stuff. But you might not know that you can also customize this for your users, as well as control the types of third-party apps that you want to give access to your users. So the decision point here from a governance standpoint is, once again, what apps do we want to give our users access to and default as well for our users? If you've ever gone to the Teams App Store, there's a lot of apps there, right? There's a ton there. We know that working with some organizations that if they don't change anything in the out-of-the-box settings within Teams, users can go and add any of those apps, right, to the particular teams. That might not necessarily be something that you want. The other thing that you can also use is the ability that if you've got a third-party app that you want to pin automatically for certain users, you can do that as well. So in the middle here, you can see that we've got the Adobe Creative Cloud here. That might be pinned maybe for a certain subset of users, like all of your marketing people, right? So they don't have to go and find that and download that through the App Store, and you can control all of those things as well. So a lot of flexibility there. We'll talk about how we can do this. And where this is set up is something called the Teams App Settings. So it's a combination of actually three things to get all of this happening. And once again, this is why this governance thing can be a little bit difficult, but they're called application setup policies, which are going to be the default apps that people see when they log into Teams. Something called an app permission policy, which are the third-party available apps you're going to make available to people, and something called org-wide settings, which is for apps, which is basically a bit more of an organizational-wide thing. So what would Lockdown Corp do? So Lockdown Corp, there's no way they're going to allow people to have any access to any third-party apps. So Lockdown Corp, from a governance standpoint, they want to remove access to any third-party apps. They don't want to allow users to add any personal apps or pin them. Basically, what Lockdown Corp wants to do is control that experience in Teams for users and not allow them to either add or customize any particular apps, right? So this seems like a pretty complex thing, but it's actually pretty easy to do with some of these settings. So the first thing that Lockdown Corp would do under the app setting is they're going to disallow third-party apps and disallow custom apps. So that's going to be their organizational-wide setting. The next thing that they're going to do is implement something called an app permission policy. So once again, this is a simple policy. This is all point and click through the Teams admin center. What they're going to do, they're going to block all Microsoft apps, block all third-party apps, and block all custom apps. Now, when you say block all Microsoft apps, you're not blocking the default set of applications that come with Teams, so chat, activity, calendar, but Microsoft also has a bunch of other apps that are basically publishers, which are like official apps. So Azure DevOps is one of them, for example. And then they're also doing what's called an app setup policy. So they're doing those org-wide settings. They're creating an app permission policy, assigning all their users to there. They're also creating an app setup policy and assigning all of their users to there. They're keeping the pinned apps as they are, but they're not allowing users to upload custom apps. They're also not allowing user pinning, right? So users can't go in and pin their own apps to that left-hand rail, essentially. So pretty locked down. Once again, we don't see this too common, but once again, you might be either starting off with Teams, so you want to have a lot of control through there, or you really need to have something that's really, really tightly controlled. Balanced industries, a little bit more balanced. So balanced industries wants people to have access to some third-party apps, but not all of them, because there's like a couple of hundred of them. Also, the other thing they have is they have a third-party solution they want to use for governance and engagement, so they want to make that a default. So what balanced industries would do for the org settings, they would allow third-party apps, but they're not allowing any new third-party apps to be published, because once again, they want to review them before they make them available for users. They're going to set up an app permission policy, which is quite different than what Lockdown Corp did. They're going to allow all the Microsoft apps. For the third-party apps, they're going to block all of them, but you've also got these options to add. So they're going to add the Adobe Creative Cloud, Jira Cloud, and Stack Overflow for Teams, because they know that their users use that. And the other thing that they're going to do as well is to add a custom app, which they want their users to use. So once again, you can see how much control you have there. From the third-party apps perspective, there's a range of options there. You can block all of them. You can block some of them, but enable some. You can enable some, but block some. There's like 4 different options there. So you've got a lot of capabilities there. And from the app setup policies, what they're going to do is they're not going to allow people to put custom apps. Now, a custom app is something that you've kind of created as an organization, or a user has downloaded an app from somewhere. They're going to allow user pinning. And what they're also going to do, they're going to stick that app at the very top because they want to use that app and assign those users to them. So once a user gets on there, they're going to see that app available through there. And for Startup Inc., they're going to use the default set of options. Now, by default, users can go in, they can add whatever third-party apps they want, they can add whatever Microsoft apps they want, they can pin, they can do all of that good stuff there also, right? So that's the other option. So you can see how different these are, how different these kind of use cases are. For Lockdown Corp, for Balanced Industries, and for Startup Inc., super simple to implement these through the Teams admin center and some other pieces to make that happen. So the next thing, once we have our apps and once we have a Teams creation process, the next big thing that we get asked a lot about is around Teams naming conventions. So the reason for that is that searching for Teams and viewing them, because there's no real hierarchy, can be a really, really huge issue. So maybe you want to have some sort of naming conventions for particular teams. So naming conventions are really around enforcing conventions around how teams and groups are going to be named. Now, once again, there's a lot of capabilities there that come out of the box there with Office 365. Now, this is once again not part of the Teams admin center. This is part of Azure AD. But in terms of naming policies, you do need to have an Azure AD Premium P1 license or an EDU license there. Most organizations do. There's a couple of things that you can do here. You can set up a naming policy where you prepend or suffix particular strings or particular user profile policies there. You can also have blocked words as well, which can be really useful. And some examples of that, I won't go too much into configuring those, but examples of that we've seen is, for project teams and sites, maybe you have as part of your governance policy, every project team has to have PRJ or PROJ prepended and then a dash and the project ID. Department sites, same thing, DEPT and a classification. A super useful one is for sites that have guest or external access enabled there also. So once again, being able to do that. And what you'll see on the left-hand side, we have just a bunch of teams without any of those naming conventions applied. So I kind of don't really know what's for what, but on the right-hand side, we can see some examples of some naming conventions applied. So I can see which teams are for departments, which teams are external. For instance, the digital initiative there has got that external tag, so I know that actually has guest or external access enabled, and I can see all of those project teams. So really simple thing. Once again, it can be automated within Office 365. It's a pretty simple automation. The other thing that you can also do is to have that as part of a governance policy that, when a user goes and requests one of these teams, they have to put in that naming convention. Unfortunately, or fortunately, you can't stop team owners from changing the name of their team later on. So they can maybe do that at another time also. So once again, that can be really useful. A couple of other things. So another thing that I think is really common from a governance perspective is, well, what should members be able to do in a particular team? And once again, the decision point here from a governance perspective is, what are members of teams allowed to do? And if you didn't know, once again, you've got a whole range of controls around this, both at an individual teams level. Teams members are people that are interacting with it within teams. They're slightly different than owners. What we're seeing for organizations, particularly when they're new to Microsoft Teams, is they want their owners to have a little bit more control in terms of managing the structure of the teams, in terms of channels and tabs, and maybe their members have a little bit less permissions there. So the way that this works is, for each particular team, you've got a number of different permissions that you can enable on or off. So things like creating channels, adding apps, adding tabs, connectors, and messages also. So a lot of flexibility there. So what would Lockdown Corp do, you think? Well, Lockdown Corp, they want to control basically what members do in Teams, so they disable everything, right? The other thing that Lockdown Corp does, which is really rare, I haven't seen people do this, but I'm sure people do this as well, is they also want to stop members, the ability for them to delete their messages or to edit their messages also. So you do have that capability on a per Teams basis. So everyone who's a member, they're going to get these permissions here. So Lockdown Corp, once again, basically what's going to happen is the only people that can do any sort of configuration changes are going to be owners. Members can still go in and collaborate. They can upload documents, they can have conversations, they can do all of those things, but they can't change the team itself. Balance Industries is a little bit different. So what Balance Industries wants to do is, they're new to Teams, right? So they want their site owners to essentially control the structure of the team in terms of channels and apps, right? But they want their members to have a little bit more flexibility, so they can add connectors. They can also add tabs through there. And this is a really interesting approach that we're finding more and more people doing. So this idea that an owner controls the structure of the team in terms of the channels and maybe the apps that are applied to the team itself. And then the members there have got some additional capabilities. Maybe they can add tabs or connectors, and they can go and add and change their messages also. So a nice flexible way. And from a governance perspective, we've seen a lot of organizations do that, where team owners have to go through additional training, they have additional responsibilities, and then team members, in order for them to simplify the interface there and some of the things they can do, they assign a team's permission, which looks something like this. And out of the box, of course, Startup Inc., they want everyone to do everything, so they just use the default out-of-the-box option that comes within Office 365. And out of the box, like I said, by default, members can do a lot of things. They can create channels, they can create private channels if you enable them to do that also, which you might not want them to be able to do. They can add apps, add tabs, connectors. They can do quite a lot there. So Startup Inc. is a little bit different. They've got no official training. What they want to do is they want everyone to go in, start using their tools, start using Teams. Members and owners can do essentially, a lot of things within a particular team. If they have any issues, they're basically going to change that later on. So the Startup Inc. Approach, by the way, this is the default set of permissions that you get when you deploy a team if you don't change any of these also. So a lot of leeway there as well. Let's talk about Teams messaging settings as well. This is another one here. So Teams messages settings. So what types of actions can users perform when using chat and channel messages within Teams? So as you know, chat and channel messages, super useful. It's kind of the whole thing around Teams, right? It's this idea that we can move away from email and start using chat for one-to-one or channel conversations within Teams. But there's a lot of stuff that has there. So Giphies and stickers and memes and all of that sort of stuff there. This is a really good example that by implementing some of these policies and settings within Teams, what you also find is that user interface slightly changes, which can make it easier for end users. One of the things we're seeing a lot with our customers is, ever since Giphy has been purchased by Facebook, there's a lot of organizations that don't want their users to use Giphy. see, you can actually just turn that off within the Teams admin center also. So how would this apply, these messaging settings apply? So lockdown Corp, obviously, they're not going to let anyone do anything. They're going to enable chat, but that's pretty much it, right? So nothing else, no memes, no stickers, none of the fun stuff. They're going to disable message translation also because it's too risky. If someone goes, puts in a message in one language, someone reads the translation in another language, maybe the business context isn't correct, for example. So they're going to have everything that's very, very tightly locked down. Balance Industries is a little bit different. So Balance Industries has some users using Slack, right? So basically what's going to happen is some users are using Slack. So they're actually going to turn off the chat function for some users. For other users, what they're going to do, they're going to make pretty much everything available, but they're not going to make read receipts available or urgent messages or using priority notifications available yet. Now, the reason for that is this is a good example of them using a governance policy to kind of control the rollout of capabilities within Teams. So what you can do for some features, it's not all of them. Let's say that the urgent priority message notification feature, if you haven't used that, you can create a message to a person, put in an alert that constantly pings them. I think it's once every 20 minutes or 10 minutes. It can be something that's really useful. It could also be super annoying. So once again, if you don't have a strategy around that, you don't have training around that, what Balance Industries is going to do is turn that off. They're going to send some training. They're going to send some information to people once they're happy that the organization knows how to use it. All they need to do is click on that on, and then that's going to be available for everyone. So once again, a bit of a different approach there in terms of how they're using things. And finally, SDI. So SDI is going to do everything. So SDI is going to come. They're going to allow users to do pretty much everything. They're good with GIFs. They're good with stickers. They're good with memes. Once again, this is, I think, pretty close to the default set that you would get. So as you can see, very, very open. The default set of options that you're going to get when you roll out Teams. So if this is not good for you, maybe you want to change some of these features as well. Once again, all done through the Teams admin center. You can also, because these are policies or settings, you can apply them to individual users. So individual users can do different things within these chat scenarios also. So our last scenario that we're going to cover is around Teams meetings, because I know this is a big thing. We're not going to cover everything around Teams meetings because it's a huge kind of topic, but we're going to talk about particularly content sharing and guests. So the decision point around this is how will users be able to share content during a Teams meeting, and what should guests be allowed to do? And the reason I think this is really poignant is we've worked with a lot of organizations where they find that Teams meeting experience pretty confusing. Like there's so many sharing options. There's whiteboard, there's PowerPoint, there's screens. But also we found a lot of organizations are having data loss when people go, they think they're sharing like they think they're sharing a PowerPoint presentation. They're actually sharing their screen, and on their screen could be a spreadsheet of something that's confidential, for example. So you can control all of that as well. And you can also control what guests can do through here as well. So Lockdown Corp, once again, they've had issues with data links. They're going to turn everything off, right? So when they start a meeting, the only thing that a person can share directly is a PowerPoint slide. That's it. They can't do screen sharing. Participants can't get control. There's no shared notes. There's no whiteboards. There's not any of that. And basically, they're not allowing anonymous users or participants in, right? So you can control this. You can actually control that meeting experience for your users with some of these governance policies, which I think is extremely powerful. Balanced Industry is a little bit more balanced. So what they're going to do, they're going to allow people to screen share, but they're only going to allow people to screen share a single application. So hopefully that stops that issue of like doing a screen share of my entire screen and accidentally, having something on there like my email, for instance. They're not going to allow external participants though to give access or to request control. So they're not going to allow people to do that. But once again, they're going to allow PowerPoint sharing and whiteboards and all of this sort of stuff as well. From the participant perspective, they're going to allow external people in. They're going to allow them to meet now in private meetings, but most of the other stuff is turned off. And then for Startup Inc., once again, they're going to allow all of the options, which is the default mode. For participants and guests, they do have guest access enabled for the meetings. They're going to allow people to start a meeting also because they just have those issues also. So once again, you can see that just through these settings, you've got a lot of features and capabilities through there. So that's kind of a really brief spin of some of those governance capabilities, some of the rules and policies that you can use. Some other common questions as well that we're finding from a governance perspective. All of this can be controlled. Can I only allow certain users to create private channels? Yes. Can I remove the external file store options? If you go to file, you can add like Dropbox and things. Yes. Can I stop users from, using the urgent notification feature? Yes. A ton of different capabilities, a ton of different features. So really the idea with this, and I know we've gone through this extremely quickly, the idea with this is, you as an organization from a governance perspective, not only can you create governance policies, roles, responsibilities, but the really nice thing is that you can also implement them really simply within Teams and within Office 365. And hopefully you saw through some of those scenarios just how flexible it is in terms of how much control you have as an organization. So a little bit around some takeaways there. Like I said, from a governance perspective, think of governance in terms of empowering and controlling your organization. The idea with governance shouldn't be from stopping users from doing things. It should be to help your users through that journey. Teams provides a ton of governance options, right? Simple, out of the box, point and click stuff that you can implement really, really easily. You can also change later on. Make sure that you think of that end user experience as well, right? This governance process of creating a governance plan shouldn't just be an IT thing. You should talk to your users, get those business requirements so you can make balanced. And really, I don't think you should roll out Teams with just the defaults, right? Because there's just a ton of stuff there that you might have available. It might not be in line with your organizational policies or goals. So spend a little bit of time at least tweaking some of those things. So I know that's a lot of information. I think we're right on 40 minutes here. We're going to stop for a moment to have some questions. If you have any questions, thoughts, or feedback, like I said, feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to help you, on your governance journey. More than happy to sit down for a little bit of time to help. You can email me at michael@orchestry.com, or in addition to that, you can also follow me on Twitter. So thank you so much for your time. I'll turn it over to see if we have any questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. So we do now have a few questions that have come in during the session. So the first one was from Thomas Foreman. He says, we are looking to implement Teams expiration policies and want to find out what teams would be affected if we turn this on. Any suggestions, or are there PowerShell commands that we need to run? So questions about finding out what teams would be affected if they implement Teams expiration policies.
So what you can do, Thomas, good question. So you can either do it through PowerShell. So in terms of configuring that expiration policy, there is a way as well to do it directly through Azure AD. And then what Azure AD will allow you to do is to apply that policy either to new teams or choose which existing teams you want to apply that policy to. So you should be good to go there. You can choose, different policies for different teams, and you can also choose whether those policies are going to be automatically applied also. So we didn't get a chance to talk about expiration policies here. Really common thing, just for people that are listening, it's that ability to control and expire content. Once again, out of the box feature, pretty simple to do. And in terms of Thomas's question, yeah, he can define them, and then he can also choose which groups are going to be basically going to be subject to that policy as well.
Perfect, thank you. And then Ashish has asked, any plans from Microsoft to allow creation of custom policy packages and then apply them to a group of users? So I probably feel Ashish's pain here. This is a question about how do you, once you've created custom policy packages, how do you apply them to a group of users? I would imagine that's from the Teams admin center question.
That is, yeah. So let's go to here. So there is something called policy packages here, Ashish, which I guess you know about. So what you can do then, so a policy package is basically a collection of policies. I assume that you can apply these to users. I'm kind of having a bit of I assume that you can apply these to individual users. Oh, you can do them one by one. So no, you can add multiple users through here. So if I want to add, let's say, one of these policy packages to this person, let's Adele here. We're going to do this live, so who knows what's going to happen here. So if I want to apply this policy package of education, I can click on apply. And once again, that'll give you that ability to do that through either the Teams admin center, Ashish, or I'm sure there's a PowerShell way that you can do that also.
Perfect. Last final question was from Anonymous. Any tips or tricks on migrating existing SharePoint governance into Teams?
Thank you, Anonymous. Tips or tricks? No, I mean, I think the interesting thing that we've found is I think a lot of those policies can apply to Teams as well as SharePoint. So definitely if you've got lifecycle management in terms of creation or in terms of disposition, all of that can apply to SharePoint also. I think what you'll find the challenge with Teams is that you have other capabilities. So, you know, the calling, the meetings and everything else that we have around here, that's all going to be net new, but definitely you can reuse some of the governance policies for you know, I guess the capabilities that Teams uses from SharePoint. So particularly around document management, metadata, even maybe naming of files. And if you've got some good naming conventions around SharePoint sites, I think you can also apply the same things to Teams.
Great, super. Thanks, Michael. So that's all the time we've got for this session. So if you'd like to talk with Michael following the session, you can find him in the breakout area. So please check the question and answer for the link to join that meeting. I'm sure Michael will be there very shortly. And I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching.
So thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.